Hi, it's Susanna Jarrett with a quick announcement before we start the episode. On this season of the Well-Trained Mind podcast, we're taking on some serious topics, so we're going to take a break to do something fun. As homeschool parents, we don't always get it right. We all have some hilarious and telling homeschool fails. For example, my siblings and I all worked together to convince my youngest brother that leopard is pronounced lippard, and he pronounced it that way for a really long time. You can share your favorite homeschool fail with us, and we might feature it on an upcoming episode of the podcast. You can email your fail to podcast@welltrainedmind.com or leave us an audio recording at www.speakpipe.com/homeschoolfails. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Thanks again for all of your support for the podcast.
Hi, I'm Susan Weisbauer, co-author of The Well-Trained Mind.
And I'm Susanna Jarrett, editor at the Well-Trained Mind Press, and we're talking about education for all parents and for all children in all sorts of settings. As a quick warning, on this episode of the Well-Trained Mind podcast, we're going to be discussing topics that are very serious, including abuse and neglect. So you may want to find a time to listen without little ears tuning in.
Oh, Susanna, I think that's our first content warning ever.
I think that is.
I think this is very exciting. We should mark this. We need to have more episodes that need content warnings.
We're moving into serious territory, but today we are joined by Terrence Massey. I'm so excited. Terrence is actually my supervisor at the Cabarrus County Guardian Ad Litem program. So thank you so much for joining us, Terrence.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So just as a quick, what is the Guardian Ad Litem program? It's a volunteer program. Some states have workers who do this work, but many have volunteers who advocate for children in the foster care system or children who have been, who have had to come into the child welfare system. And so every child who comes into the child welfare system is supposed to have an advocate in court. And that advocate is very often a volunteer who gets to know that child, who gets to know their case, who gets to know their circumstances, and then who either writes a court report or even appears in court to advocate on their behalf. So Terrence oversees all the Guardian Ad Litems in Cabarrus County and has been a wonderful supervisor for me as I have been on this journey of volunteering and absolutely loving it. I totally recommend it for anyone who's looking for a very flexible, time-wise volunteer opportunity with a high impact.
And I just want to speak really briefly because we're going to get Terrence to talk in a minute about his background and all of the stuff that he does. And I'm very excited for you guys to hear from him. But I was really excited about this particular podcast because, and we're going to get into all of this in more detail, a lot of times objections to homeschooling involve, homeschooling opens up the possibility of child abuse in a way that other educational systems don't. And we're going to talk about that. But I think this sort of this correlation between homeschooling and the possibility of child abuse can't really be discussed until we take some time to talk about what systems are out there for children who are in need, for children who are being abused or neglected. And so we really wanted to bring on a guest who works in the child welfare system. And Terrence works alongside social workers, guardians ad litem, volunteers, and others who help families in need. And as we talk about homeschooling and not parallel the problems of child abuse and child neglect, we have to acknowledge that a lot of homeschoolers are still very, very, very suspicious of the child welfare system. And Susanna, you're younger than I am, and you experienced this growing up.
Yeah, I was homeschooled in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I don't know if it was just that time period or my family or whatever, but we were scared of social workers and of that system. I remember my brother using it as a threat to get us to quiet down. If he was babysitting us and we were being too rowdy, he'd be like, I see a social worker, and try to get us to be quiet, which worked. I guess I don't know where it came from, but we were scared of social workers.
Yeah, sure. You had absorbed the idea that there's this government agency, and what the government agency is going to do is come and take you out of your home, look for any excuse to take you out of your home. I mean, I was homeschooled in the the 70s. And then I homeschooled my own children in the 90s. And certainly that was a really prevalent like strain of rhetoric in the homeschool world. There were all of these guides to it. If a social worker shows up at your door, do they ever do? I don't know. If a social worker shows up at your door, don't let them in because once they have a foot in, they can take your children away. I mean, there was this sort of demonization, and I use that term advisedly, of people who were working in the child welfare system. So we do want to talk about homeschooling, cases of child abuse within homeschooling, how that has been portrayed in the media. But we really just wanted to have someone who actually works in the child welfare system to speak for himself, which I'm now going to let Terrence do since we've been talking for 5 minutes without letting him talk. So Terrence, tell us about what you do and who you are.
So I'm Terrence Massey. I am the guardian ad litem supervisor here in Cabarrus County. A little bit about my background. I am a graduate of Montreat College. I'm an adoptive parent of 3 children. I'm currently working on my marriage and family therapy degree. And I've been in the child welfare system. I started out as a foster parent. I became adoptive parent. And then I was a guardian ad litem volunteer. And then I became a guardian ad litem supervisor. So I've been in the crux of it for a while now. And definitely understand the stigma behind homeschooling, in the early parts of it. I will say that COVID-19 brought about 2 folds to homeschooling, right? Mm-hmm. It brought about that there isn't a reasonable amount of parents that are able to do it and do it effectively. Mm-hmm. Then there's the parents that do it because they want to be able to slide under the radar and not have the system in their business or their everyday life.
Yeah. Susanna, make a note. That's another episode. We got to do that one. Homeschooling because you want to slide under the radar. Slide under the radar. We need to talk some more about that. So Terrence, we're so glad you could be here with us. And just for the sake of our listeners, you are not a homeschooler.
I am not.
Yes. So we're bringing you in from the other side, as I would have been told when I was a kid. Okay. So Susanna, let's you and I just sort of lay out how homeschooling and its relationship to either neglect or abuse of children has recently been portrayed in the media. And then, Terrence, we're going to loop you back in to talk about what those words abuse and neglect actually mean. And, it's interesting. Susanna, and you and I both saw this, that Peter Jamieson of the Washington Post released a whole series of articles that almost without let up painted homeschooling in a negative light. And I have to say, I spent a lot of time on the phone with that reporter. He called me for background information. I spent hours and hours with him talking about homeschooling, and he neither cited me nor did he accurately represent what I said, which I guess I should be grateful for since, he didn't cite me. But I was so upset with these articles because they were just overwhelmingly about dysfunctional family situations, which happen to a lot of different families, but every single one connected this dysfunction not to psychological problems or bad family systems, but specifically to homeschooling. And I remember when I objected to these articles on my Facebook page, I got absolutely slammed by a very irate gentleman who runs an advocacy group for survivors of child abuse, who said that he went to the welltrainedmind.com website, which is the website where we talk about classical education, and he searched the whole thing, and nowhere on the entire website was there any reference to child abuse, which proved that I was whitewashing the whole issue. And I thought to myself, okay, the site is about classical education and homeschooling. It is not a site about either the prevention of or the detection of child abuse. Why is it that a homeschooling website automatically has to have this? But there seemed to be this automatic connection between the two.
Yeah, and I've seen that trend with calls for regulating homeschooling more carefully, rooted in this idea that homeschooling is for hiding abuse. And so that's kind of where the idea for this episode started, was to look at, is that really the case? And what are common sense and and reasonable regulations of homeschooling, what does that look like?
Right, right. It would have been for that particular series. I don't want to pick on the Washington Post too much, but they're big. They can take it. It would have been a lot more effective for it either to have been a series about homeschooling, genuinely about homeschooling, with perhaps one or two of the pieces discussing, these, because a lot of the focus was on either on children who had been horribly damaged or adults who looked back at their homeschooling and said, this damaged me. Either on homeschooling with one or two of the episodes dealing with that, or it could have been a series on child abuse and neglect with how homeschooling can be part of this in some very dysfunctional situations as one of the pieces. But it was this sort of unrelenting connection of the two that I just found very troubling.
For sure. And I think for the purpose of this discussion and understanding what is the connection, is there a connection between these things, it would be really helpful to have a definition of these terms, because abuse is a very serious term. Neglect is a very serious term. But maybe, Terrence, you could help speak to what do these terms really mean?
So when you're talking about child and child abuse, and when we're looking at the definition of abuse, neglect, and dependency, we're looking at, when you're talking about neglect, is the child able to have a reasonable portion of what a childhood should look like? Do they have access to generally the standards that North Carolina looks for? Meaning, do they have running water, lights, and if they are living in a home, does that home have four walls and a roof?
So basic housing.
So it is the basic bare minimum that is looked for. Okay. Homelessness and homeschooling is not a reason for children to be taken into care. And I think then when you're talking about abuse, what does abuse look like? So, because abuse is a broad word, but what does it look like to you? So is the abuse discipline, or is it mental abuse, emotional abuse? All those things come into factor when you're looking at defining abuse and neglect.
So, Terrence, I wonder if you could just take a minute and go back to, because you used the word discipline. Can you give us some examples of discipline that would be considered physical abuse? And we can just talk about North Carolina, since that's where you're working, and forms of discipline that would not be considered physical abuse.
So forms of physical abuse would be anything that you do that leaves a mark on the child.
Okay.
Any time that the child shows up with a mark or scratches, anything, and it came from an adult figure, would be considered physical abuse.
Okay.
When you start talking about emotional abuse, you're talking about when you're having a child stand in the corner for 2-3 hours, or holding an object because they couldn't stop fidgeting in school, or not listening to you. So it's more you're doing more emotional psyche abuse than the physical part. But then on the other hand, the things that you do positive discipline is, do you talk to the child about why do they do certain things and how this can affect them long term? I can say from my own experience that when my children do something, I talk to them about, okay, what is the reasoning behind this? Is it just normal childhood behavior, or am I looking at it from an adult standpoint and I need to be looking at it from a child standpoint? And so with that, we have to do positive reinforcement versus going to, oh my God, I'm mad. And
right.
So lashing out.
So I think it would be helpful actually at this point, because I want to go back to those fears from the 80s and 90s that, their children are going to be yanked out of your home. I think a lot of those fears did come from more conservative families who, okay, this was not good, spanked their children. I mean, I was spanked growing up. I think most people, Oh, okay. All right. So Suzanne, and you're younger than I am. I mean, we're all survivors of spanking. I mean, I'm 56. So it's everybody I knew was spanked. And I'm just going to be really open and genuine here and say that I spanked my oldest two children, who are now 35 and 33. Never laid a hand on the younger two because something clicked in my brain and I thought, what on earth am I doing? Why am I perpetuating this? It's what I grew up with. So it seemed normal. And I will say that my husband and I have both gone back to our older children and said, we are sorry. Please forgive us. We should never We should never have laid a hand on you. But I think that back in the days when my children were young, there was a very strong sense that we were disciplining our children in the way that we had been taught was right and good and would be good for them. And that outside of us was this huge permissive world that just wanted to let children do whatever they wanted. And if we allowed someone from that world, someone from the outside, from the system, Terrence, that you're part of, to look in at what we were doing with our children, we were going to get in really, really big trouble. So I'm just curious how you would respond to that fear, because I think it's still present in a lot of families.
I think that spanking, we all have been spanked. I didn't have a spanking. I got whooping. So
Depends what part of the country you're from, I guess.
And so for me, it depends on, has the spanking reached a level to where it is affecting the child?
Oh, that's interesting. Talk a little more about that.
So when I think of discipline, are you spanking the child on a regular basis, or are you holding out for this spanking because of really bad consequences? And there are times when, we don't, as child welfare advocate workers, we never condone putting your hands on the child. But as a parent, you have to weigh out your options. Did this reach the level of deserving a spanking, or what is the punishment? Because I think my children's age, I believe that, does it mess with their psyche if I'm punishing them for 7 days straight, or will just a talk do, or does a spanking, does it require them being spanked? I don't personally spank because I feel like it just wears me out and it makes my children madder. And so I come up with creative ways to come up with punishment. I take away the electronics. I do other things.
Right. Yeah. And that's one thing that impressed me coming from the homeschool world that was so afraid of the child advocacy world into being a volunteer. One thing that I was really impressed with going through like the volunteer training was that I had this idea from growing up that like they're out to take us away from our families. And when I went through the training, I found out that every part of my job as a volunteer is to keep children with their families as much as possibly possible. That research shows that as much as we possibly can, keep kids with their families. That's what we want to be doing. And so a huge part of my job is trying to figure out how can we make reunification happen, even if the child has been taken away because of a case of serious neglect. How can we support the families to come back together again in a healthy way? And that's something that I don't think I had growing up in the homeschool world. I thought, oh, they were just out to get us, to take us away, to do who knows what. But that's so not the heart and the goal of the child welfare system now that I'm on the inside.
Oh, and Terrence, you can speak to that. Do you want other people's children?
I was just going to tell you, we do not want to take children. We want to work on preserving families and reunification. And because there are two parts to the child welfare system, there is the family in-home services, and then there is the piece where me and Susanna work on, right? And we work on once the child has been taken out of the home. What does that look like? And even then, we're still working on family preservations. And because we want families to stay together, we want children to be reunited with their families. And because studies have shown us that no matter what a child goes through, they always want to be with their parent. They always want to be with their parent. And so we definitely don't want to take your children. And we want to work hard to get families reunited. And when we can do that, that is a success, right? So we're always wanting to keep families together.
Yeah. That's one thing that impressed me too, is when we're working with extreme situations, because we work with extreme situations, children who have had to be taken out of the home. But our first look is always, is reunification possible? That's like always the first option. And how can we make that happen? And then going from there when that's absolutely not safe for the child. But it's definitely not, we want to take your kids.
We'll be back after this. Are you looking for an open and go, no-nonsense approach to teaching reading? Our program, The Ordinary Parent's Guide to Teaching Reading, isn't fancy or expensive, gimmicky or complex. It is affordable, straightforward, and efficient. We believe that a strong, confident foundation in reading is one of the best gifts we can give our children. So our program makes teaching phonics doable for every parent. Scripted, open and go lessons empower you to teach your child to read in just 10 to 20 minutes a day. The original Ordinary Parent's Guide to Teaching Reading helped 1 million parents teach their children to read. Now our revised edition takes the same time-tested principles and matches them with an easier-to-use design. Check out samples on our website, welltrainedmind.com, and use the code PODCAST at checkout for 15% off your purchase. Happy reading!
So we've been talking, and I think this is just such an important discussion to have, because I particularly there are certain quite conservative homeschool oriented organizations that I feel like do sort of promulgate this idea that the government is out to get your children and you've got to protect them no matter what. So it's so helpful for us to talk to someone who is in the child welfare system and hear them say, no, that's really not what we want to do here. This is really not the point. But let's do a little bit of a pivot here now, though, and come back to this idea that homeschooling can provide a cover for abuse and or neglect in a way that other situations don't. So, Susanna, let's you and I talk about this for a few minutes. And then, Terrence, I want to pull you back in to talk about this idea of educational neglect and sort of where that falls in the whole, scale of things that child welfare might get involved with. So, Susanna, I know that there's a case that you kept seeing pop up over and over again in, pieces that link homeschooling to either child abuse or child neglect.
Yeah, so this is actually an older case from about 2016, 17 of a tragic event with a young man named Matthew Toreto, who was 17 years old, nonverbal autistic child, and ended up being actually killed by his abusive mother. And at the time of his death, he was enrolled in school, but he was truant. He hadn't appeared in school for a long time. And Child and Protective Services had been involved in his life from a very young age. His mother hadn't been appearing at court dates. There's a lot of things going on in his life leading up to his death. But the report that came out in the wake of his death suggested increased regulation of homeschooling because his mother had filed intent to homeschool his sister 2 months prior to his death. So he was enrolled in school, but truant. His mother had tried to pull his sister out of school. Then after that report came out, the city did a study of homeschoolers in the area that has been cited quite often by folks who are advocating for stricter regulation of homeschooling, sort of linked to this case. I think it's just important to point out that Matthew was actually enrolled in school. He wasn't
actually homeschooled.
Right.
Yeah.
He wasn't. But his case has been used by people calling for more regulation of homeschooling.
Right. And we don't want to, there are some very active networks of sort of grown homeschoolers out there who feel very strongly that they did experience neglect and abuse, and that homeschooling allowed that neglect and abuse to continue without providing any way for other adults or for child welfare workers to step in and to see what was going on. This is such a tricky one for me because, I grew up on a farm. I was homeschooled on a farm. I raised all my kids on a farm. I am sure that if we had had some sort of unscheduled drop by some child welfare worker who received a complaint from our neighbors, they would have probably seen half-naked children sprinting around barefoot in the mud, screaming like crazy. I mean, there were times when our homeschooling did kind of look like, a junior version of the Lord of the Flies. And I would not want there to be a regulation that said, we're going to check up on your homeschooled kids and make sure that they're wearing shoes and, have actually brushed their teeth that morning, because or even clean, because a lot of times they actually weren't clean. I would have hated that. I would have felt it was intrusive and I would have felt it was unfair. But on the other hand, I really do support the importance of oversight in children's lives. If you let me just go on a tiny bit of a tangent here. My husband and I, we love sappy movies. And we really like the movie About a Boy with Hugh Grant, where he gets involved with a single mother and her son. And one of the things that the son says about 3/4 of the way through the movie is that it takes more than two people to raise a child and keep a family together. It's bigger than two people. You need more people. And I can see where homeschooling could be a way to push out all of the sort of useful eyes, ears, and voices that otherwise could say, hey, that child needs something that they're not getting. That child is not okay. So I feel very divided about that. And I know we're going to get into that discussion a little bit later. But maybe first, Susanna, could you talk a little bit about the research? Are homeschooled students more likely to be abused?
So right now, the current research finds that homeschooled students are not more likely to be abused than students at public schools. Really horribly, abuse happens everywhere. And I think, there are cases where it's used as a cover, but because you're homeschooling doesn't make it more likely that that would happen.
And Terrence, have you had experience with homeschooling? And please just be very honest here. Homeschooling being either a cover or an enabler for abuse?
Not in the past couple of years. I will say COVID, again, I'll go back to what I said earlier, COVID-19 and children being remotely, that did do a cover up. And when it was time for children to go back to school, children were still not being found and they were already on the radar of abuse before going out remotely. But the homeschooling community within itself is not ravaged by social workers and child advocacy workers looking to come and take your children. So no, from my standpoint in Cabarrus County, we have not experienced a lot of that. And I volunteer in Mecklenburg County also as a guardian ad litem, and I have not have experienced that as well.
Can you, and if you don't feel comfortable answering this question, please don't, but can you list 2 or 3 of the situations that most often result in a child being removed from the home, which of course is like the most extreme thing that we're all hoping won't have to happen?
So children being neglected, children being dependent, meaning that they are having to find their own way, sexually abused children.
So when you say, if we can go back to, because I think sexual abuse is a clear, huge red flag. When you say children having to find their own way, are you talking about food, clothing?
They're having to find, when I say find their own way, meaning that there's no adult figure in the house that is able to help to provide for them and give them the basic life skills.
Gotcha.
Meaning they're coming home to an empty house every day. The lights are not on, the water's not on. They're having to go to the neighbors to get water or to watch television, or they're having to go down, go down the street to the local McDonald's and beg for food. That becomes a dependent child, a neglected child. But again, because homelessness, and it's twofold and it sounds crazy, but homelessness is not a reason to take the child, but you can be homeless and still take care of your children, right? And you can homeschool and be effective in homeschooling. And I think more so the early on part, because there were not a lot of regulation, there were a lot more regulations on homeschooling in the 70s and the early 2000s and late 90s than it is now, because they had to take a dramatic shift when children went remotely, right? And so that put people in situations that are not teachers. Like, I'm not a teacher by trade, I know how to do the work. I can try to figure it out. But then also, how do I help my child to continue to stay on this path so that when they do go back to school, are they on their grade level? Will they be successful? And if they're not on the grade level, then the fear is that I do everything. And are they going to send a child advocacy worker or a social worker to my home to start investigating? Right. So, the levels have to be extreme for the child welfare system to come in and take your child. They're not taking your child just because they're not performing on grade level. They're taking your child because they haven't been active in their participation as far as attendance. You're not showing that when you're talking about educational neglect, you're not showing that, you're able to teach this child on the level that they're able to understand.
I mean, I would think that a lot of homeschool parents would be a little bit nervous about this idea of educational neglect, because I think a lot of homeschool families have at least one child that they're homeschooling because the kid just wasn't getting it in the classroom, right? So they were in the classroom, they're a third grader, but they're operating on a first grade basis. And that was happening in the classroom. They weren't getting it. And so for a lot of parents, one of the reasons they start homeschooling is this sort of sense of desperation, as this kid can't manage in the classroom. So you bring the kid home and you work with them for a year, and then they're a fourth grader and they're operating on maybe a second grade level. So they're not doing any worse than they were when they were in the classroom. But I think there's this fear that that gap in the grade level then might be taken as an opportunity for some aspect of the child welfare system to get involved.
Well, in that aspect, there will be documentation, right, that the child was on a certain grade level when you decided to take them out
interesting,
and
yes.
homeschool them. So you would have documentation. It's not like you took the child out and they were performing, they were doing okay, and then you took them out and then now you've homeschooled them for a year and send them back and they're still, not performing, or they're at a lower benchmark than what they were before you took them out. When I think of homeschool, I think of the intent. So I have to look at the family dynamics. If I'm in the school realm and I get this notification that this family now has the intent to do homeschooling. So when I'm looking at family, I'm looking at the overall family. Has this been an involved family in the school? Has this child really struggled with the socialization piece of school? Has this child really struggled just to grasp, the educational piece? And will this child benefit from doing more one-on-one that homeschooling can give them? And then if all those in my mind check the box off that yes, then I'm not so much worried about them being homeschooled. But if one of the boxes is not checked off, then I may want to put them on the radar for, Child Protective Services, or to make an anonymous call. And so the thing is that homeschoolers don't have to fear social workers as much as children that go to traditional schools do.
Right.
You see my child every day, and because my child may have gotten a fight with his siblings and lip got busted, or he has some scratches, I now have to fear that this teacher is going to make an anonymous call and say that this child is being abused, right? So that goes into homeschooling. You don't have to fear that as much as the child that's actually going to school as that parent does.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I think it is true that abuse happens everywhere, right? We'd like to think that that isn't the case, but it is just a reality. And parents who actually are abusive, I mean, how many cases of abused children, not only, brutalized, but sometimes even murdered by their parents, have happened with kids who are actually in a classroom every day? This can happen in any setting, but I think when you're homeschooling, a lot of times parents are homeschooling to prevent abuse because they're afraid of, and I don't look, I'm a fan of public education because I don't think every parent should homeschool. I don't think every parent can homeschool. And I don't think every child flourishes in a homeschooling environment. And I think we need to have a high quality, well-supported system to make sure that children are educated. So I am, unlike a lot of other homeschool advocates, I'm a fan of public education. But at the same time, there are parents who realize that maybe their particular educational situation is not safe. There's teachers that can't be trusted. There may be coaches, bus drivers. How many different adults have been fingered as child abusers who are part of the school system? So, all of which is to say, I think a lot of parents homeschool not to cover up abuse, but to protect from it.
I would say that.
And with all that being said, there's so much that we've been talking about. So there's the piece of, homeschooling, according to the research that we have right now, there's no evidence that shows that homeschoolers are more abused. However, we have talked about how abuse happens everywhere, and homeschool kids aren't in contact with mandatory reporters as often as a kid in a public school situation. So with all that being said, I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on on what are, if any, common sense, appropriate, reasonable regulations on homeschooling.
Oh boy. Okay, yeah. This is where I'm going to get letters, but I'll start out. So I am a fan, and those of you who have read what I write and have maybe even listened to me on this podcast know that I am not a huge supporter of standardized testing because I think it is a for-profit, deeply flawed way of assessing how kids are doing. Having said that, I think there is a lot of value in testing your kids every year. Pick a standardized test you could administer at home. We've before recommended Seton Hill. Give them the test, get it graded by the experts, and put those results on file. That helps you as the parent know that you're not falling down in some way that's going to disadvantage the kid later on. It gives you a track record. So if your fourth grader is testing 2 grades below in math, you can say, yes, that's been the case since kindergarten. We're working on it. We're moving on up. We're doing our best. This is just where this kid is at. It is a way of subjecting your family system to a very mild but very important accountability. And I think that as a parent, if you're trying to avoid all accountability, you need to do some hard thinking about why. Why are you so afraid of opening up your family to an outside view? What are you so terrified of? I mean, as Terrence, you've just said, the child welfare system does not want to take your children. That's not the point. That's not the goal. If you are absolutely paranoid about letting outside gazes see what you're doing, then I think that is a family problem. So in this situation, I think yearly standardized testing is a really good thing. I'm going to go, and not only a good thing, but I think conscientious parents should do this every year. I'm going to go one step further. And, I'm a physician's daughter, so I actually tend to trust the medical system, but I would not be opposed to homeschoolers having to submit a yearly report from their pediatrician, because that is a unbiased, trained outside view that says, yep, kid's doing okay. And I'm not just talking about no bruises, no gouges, no marks, but, immunizations, just teeth, basic care. These are things that can actually slide in homeschool families. And I will again out myself a little bit and say I had 4 kids. My youngest, I did a terrible job keeping up with her vaccinations. I did a great job. I mean, until she was 2, she got everything. She got MMR, she got polio. I didn't fall down on any of that. But all of the boosters that they're supposed to get as they got older, I was going in 4 different directions with 4 different kids. And when she applied to go to the Montessori middle school when she was 13, I took her in and I said, okay, I messed up. She has not had all of her vaccinations. What do we do? And I still have pictures because the very kind doctor said, we're going to get her caught up now. And I have this picture of like these 4 nurses coming in with syringes because they said it's going to be the kindest thing if we just do them all at once. And my poor daughter is just sitting on this table, just getting all of her vaccinations simultaneously. And I did take her out for ice cream afterwards, which fortunately she remembers. No. But it is really easy as a homeschool parent to lose track of these things. This is my point. And that's not great for the kids. And if I had to submit like a yearly pediatrician report, I wouldn't have had to put my daughter through that. And that's the kind of thing where if a kid is in school, you have to keep up with it. And if they're not in school, it's easy to let it slide. So those would be my 2 recommended: yearly pediatrician report, standardized testing.
I would have to agree with you as well. My regulations would mirror that, and have your curriculum laid out when you're getting ready to teach your child. And that way you're keeping up with it. This is what I taught them in kindergarten, and this is what I taught in first grade, second grade, and taking them to the doctor. And if it helps, look at the curriculum of the public school curriculum and what they require. And that way you can keep that same goal when you're homeschooling. So if there ever does, a child advocacy worker ever does come to your home, you have everything right here in my book. I can go to it. I can pinpoint. They had their physical. This is their last time they had their dental. This is the last time we took standardized tests. Yeah, they're struggling in science, but this is what I've been doing. What we've been doing these to help get them to this point.
Yeah. Little plug for the well-trained mind. We have checklists for each grade and each subject. And I know a lot of parents have told us that those are really helpful in laying out the goals for the year. And Virginia is one of the states that does actually ask you to submit a plan of study. And I think that that's a really useful thing. And those lists can be used for your plan of study as well.
I'm probably more on team lower regulation, although I totally agree with doing all of these things, having records, being organized with your plan of study, having standardized testing regularly just to kind of see where things are panning out. But as far as legal requirements, I tend to fall on the side of lower regulation because I feel like so many parents are pulling their children out of school because the school system isn't working for their particular child. And I don't want there to be anything keeping parents from doing that if that's really the right thing for their child. And I think I was hearing Terrence say earlier with COVID, where you saw these issues with abuse, it was kids disappearing during COVID who already were in the system. So I think the regulation that I think might be reasonable would be for families that have substantiated cases and history with the system to have a little bit more of a welfare check or something if they choose to pull their kids out. Not just, an anonymous report that ended up not coming to anything, but substantiated reports. Maybe there be welfare checks on those kids so that you're catching kids who are being pulled out for the wrong reasons, but for parents pulling their children out of the system for the regular reasons, the normal reasons, I feel like it's their right to homeschool how they see fit.
So I think we kind of went in a little bit of a different direction on this podcast than I thought that we were going to. But I really think if parents could take anything away from this, and Terrence, I'm just going to let you either, I hope, agree with what I'm about to say and then wrap us up here, or disagree, and then we'll tape it again and say something different. How should I put this? My parents started homeschooling us in 1972 when homeschooling, it wasn't illegal and it wasn't exactly legal. It was sort of in a gray zone. And I think throughout the 70s and then pretty much into the 80s, a lot of homeschool families really felt like they were under siege, that they were doing something that was kind of weird, and that in particular government agencies were looking for every opportunity to interfere with what they were doing and stop it and take their children away. And Susanna, you and I have talked quite a bit about there's some very conservative Protestant end times theology that also lies behind that basically pits the righteous family against the evil government. And that's a really powerful rhetoric that leads a lot of homeschooling families to carry into 2024, this idea that the government is really just out to get them. And one of the things I love about having Terrence on this podcast is that, so as the representative of the evil government state, which wishes to take people's children away from them, Terrence, you're on here saying, all we want to do is make sure that the kids are okay.
Yes, absolutely. We want to make sure that the children are okay. And we don't want to take your children. I want to repeat that. We are not lurking around in homeschooling to take your children. We have children that are right in our face that need our support and need us. And again, so we are always looking for what's going to be in the best interest of the child. And we are not in the business of coming in to take your child. And I don't want anybody out there that's homeschooling to have that worry, because it is a myth. And I will say with my own children, they are in public school, and I threatened them to homeschool them. That if your behavior, if your grades not on par, my daughter will tell you, she's in middle school now. I have threatened her for 2 years straight, starting from third grade all the way up into fifth grade. Do I need to pull you out this semester and homeschool you, or this quarter? And so we are the government, as I represent the government. We are definitely not wanting to take your children and to break apart your families.
Oh my gosh. I think we need t-shirts, Susanna, that says shape up or I'm going to homeschool you.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, Terrence, it's really lovely to have you on and to hear you talk about it. I mean, what I hear you saying is that there's so many children in desperate need of just basic support so that they can survive and have a chance to become adults. That you're not interested in micromanaging what people are doing around the kitchen table at 9 a.m.
I am not. We are not. We are not. And I will tell you, when those type of cases do come in, we fight to get them out. We fight to say, no, these parents are just doing what they feel is best for their children. And when we're looking at cases, we also have to look at what is culture, right? And is this part of this family's culture? Not the abuse part, but, how they're speaking to their children and what are they doing. Is homeschooling part of the culture? Like you all got homeschool. So that's part of your culture, right? Homeschooling wasn't part of my culture. And so my children know homeschool is not part of our culture. But if I threaten it with homeschool, it puts it in the atmosphere and it disrupts their normal flow, right? Getting up, going to school every day is a part of their normal flow.
Sure.
So we have to look at what has this family experienced and to help the family get to where they need to be and continue on the trend of what is best for their culture in their home and the outside world as well.
Yep. That's very well put. Susanna, you want to wrap us up here?
Yeah. Thank you all for listening this episode. We're so excited, Terrence, that you could be with us. And thank you all for sticking with us for this very serious topic.
Thank you for listening to the Well-Trained Mind podcast. You can find Susan at facebook.com/susan.wise.bauer and Susanna on Instagram at hopintohomeschool. Our engineering and mixing is done by AJ Falari at ajfalari.online. This podcast is produced by Well-Trained Mind Press, and our supervising producer is Chris Bauer. If you enjoyed the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have questions, responses, or ideas for future episodes, email us at podcast@welltrainedmind.com. We'll be back next week, so stay tuned.